An infertile princess queen was given to a human. She returned, changed. The door sealed behind me, and the sound of Vethkai Prime disappeared, and I knew in that moment that my father had not even waited to watch the ship leave. My name is Elindra Voshal, first daughter of Emperor Voshal of the Vethkai Dominion, a civilization 4,000 years old that had once watched humanity discover fire from a comfortable distance and found the spectacle mildly entertaining. I had been educated by scholars who mapped star systems before Earth had a name, trained in politics, battlefield theory, and the 37 dialects of every world the Dominion had absorbed, traded, or simply outlasted. That morning, my father disposed of me with less deliberation than he used when selecting his evening meal. The official term was diplomatic alliance. The reality was simpler. I was sterile, according to 3 Vethkai medical tribunals, which meant I could not produce an heir, which meant I was a liability wearing a title. A human frontier commander had arrived to negotiate mining rights along contested space. My father saw an efficient solution. He gave the human something that looked like value and cost him nothing. He gave me. I had 48 words of farewell from my family. I counted them at the time and have counted them many times since, in the particular way you count things that are supposed to be larger than they are. 48 words for 30 years of living. Sevi, my attendant since childhood, stood at my right side as the corridor of the human vessel came into view. I could feel her trying not to cry. She was never good at hiding it. I had always loved that about her, in the way you love things in people that are the opposite of what you were trained to be. I kept my face still. That is the first skill of Vethkai royalty. You learn it before anything else. You do not break where people can see. The corridor smelled like metal and something warm I did not recognize. A man was walking toward us. I had studied the diplomatic file on Commander Darian Holt of the Colonial Authority 3 days before launch. Decorated frontier officer, age 41, moderate military career, assigned to this diplomatic exchange because of his experience working near non-human populations. The file described him as average height, brown hair going gray at the sides, no remarkable history. What the file had not mentioned was the way he moved. Not fast, not slow, deliberate, like someone who had lived through enough genuine emergencies to know the difference between one and a situation that merely looked like one. He crossed the corridor toward us without hesitation, looked at me directly, and then did something I had not prepared for. He said my name. Not Princess Queen, not First Daughter, not the diplomatic title printed across 12 pages of formal documentation. He said, "Elindra, welcome aboard the Meridian," and he held out his hand in that particular human greeting, palm open, waiting. I looked at it. Then I took it. His grip was firm and brief. He let go first. "Commander Holt," I said. "Darian," he said. "We're going to be traveling together a long time. Might as well use names." I had no prepared answer for that. I had prepared answers for Commander Holt. I had not prepared anything for Darian. He showed us to quarters, his own, which he had already vacated without being asked or told. I said it was unnecessary. He said the rooms had a better viewport and that I should take them. Then he left. Sevi looked at me. "Don't," I said. She nodded. "Barely." The ship launched 2 hours later. I stood at the viewport and watched Vethkai Prime reduce itself. Blue gold, enormous, then smaller, then a point of light, then nothing particular among 1,000 other points. I kept my face completely still the entire time. I spent the first 3 days alone, studying stellar charts, reading, writing correspondence I did not send. The ship was loud in the way human ships always are. Voices in hallways, movement, the particular quality of noise that people make when they are comfortable with each other and not bothering to be quiet. I found it irritating. I also found myself listening. On the 4th day, Darian knocked. He had 2 cups of the warm, sharp-smelling liquid. He said he thought I might want company, but if not, he could leave the drinks and go. "What is that?" I asked, looking at the cups. "Coffee," he said. "Sit down, I'll explain." That explanation lasted 3 hours. Coffee led to trade routes. Trade routes led to the history of the frontier colonies. The history of the colonies led to an argument about military strategy that neither of us won. And then it was very late, and we were both still talking. He disagreed with me clearly and without apology, which I was not accustomed to from anyone outside a formal debate setting. After that, I tested him. I want to be honest about this. I am Vethkai, and when something disrupts my equilibrium, I apply pressure to it until I understand its composition. I was cold with him. I made precise remarks about human limitations, the brevity of their lives, the youth of their civilization, the emotional inefficiency of their decision-making under pressure. I said all of it without softening. He did not fold. He did not apologize for his species. Once, I told him that humanity's expansion into the outer systems was a fascinating exercise in optimism, given how thoroughly the geological data suggested it should fail. He looked at me and said, calmly, that in his experience, optimism was almost always more accurate than the pessimistic model when you were actually in the field. That is not statistically supportable, I said. Statistically, he agreed. But here we are, having coffee in the outer systems, and he let the argument finish itself without his help. I thought about that for 2 days. When the Meridian broke orbit over Kalem Station, I told myself I was prepared for what I would find below. I had read the survey data: thin atmosphere, poor soil composition, high geological risk, minimal resource projection, a small human colonial settlement, barely viable by any external assessment. The kind of settlement that appears in colonial expansion, records as a flag on a map and a row of numbers. The landing corrected my assumption immediately. The colony was built into the red rock of a plateau, structures of pressed earth and recycled composite, food crops growing under filtered light domes, power lines running between buildings that someone had reinforced with careful, limited materials. Children were moving between the structures in the red afternoon light. People were working and talking and moving with the ease of people who know every corner of their home. It should not have survived. By every Vethkai calculation I had ever been taught, this settlement was a structural mistake. I stood at the landing pad and looked at it. Darian stood beside me. There was something in his face I did not have a category for. I would learn later that the word was pride. "How long?" I asked. 62 years, he said. "My grandmother's generation started it." "It should not have worked," I said. "No," he said. "Probably not." The colonists were cautious with me at first. Some curious, some quietly hostile, in the particular way of people who have decided not to be rude about something they are uncertain of. I was tall by their standard, with the faint iridescent quality of Vethkai skin, eyes that caught light at a different angle, hands that moved in patterns outside their instinctive reading. A man named Owen, large, quiet, responsible for the colony's power grid, watched me without speaking for 4 full days. On the 5th, I walked directly up to him and told him that prolonged observation without communication was considered a challenge display among my people, and that I hoped he intended no provocation. He stared at me for a moment. Then he laughed, a completely genuine sound, nothing careful about it, and said he was simply bad at talking first. Owen taught me how the power grid worked. On my 3rd day of learning it, I identified a redesign in one section that would cut their energy loss by 11%. I submitted the design to the engineering team and said nothing further about it. Owen came to find me an hour later. He stood in front of me with the design in his hand, looked at it, then at me, and said, very quietly, "Huh." I understood that as acceptance. The day after that, Owen introduced me to the rest of the technical team as though it were entirely ordinary. No announcement, no ceremony. He simply walked me into the workshop where Felix and 2 other engineers were going over maintenance logs and said, "This is Alindra. She fixed the grid loss problem that's been bothering us for 8 months." And then he went back to what he had been doing. Felix looked at me for a long moment. Then he looked at the grid schematics on his own screen and said, without looking up again, "You have any thoughts on the pressure coupling on Relay 7? I had. We talked for 2 hours. I watched the colony's social structure with the analytical precision I had been trained to use. What I found did not fit any model I had been given. They kept people who served no functional purpose. An elderly woman named Vera, the colony's founding historian, confined now to a mobility chair, contributed nothing to physical labor or technical output. She was fed, housed, and visited every day by people who had no obligatory reason to be there, not from duty, from something else. I made a point of walking past her quarters on my 3rd week. She called out to me through the open window. She had been watching people move through the yard the way people do when they have lived somewhere long enough to know everyone's gait. And she said, "You're the Vethkai woman. I've been wanting to talk to you since you arrived. I have questions." She had 17 of them ready. About Vethkai architecture, about how the Dominion calculated territory boundaries, about whether the Vethkai had ever developed oral historical traditions before their written systems. I answered every one. She took no notes because, she told me, at her age memory was either there or it was not, and notes only gave you the illusion of understanding something you had not yet absorbed. I came back the next day. There was also a boy whose condition affected his development in ways that meant he would never work the fields or manage the systems. He was treated with a careful, watchful tenderness that I found genuinely difficult to process. When someone spoke too sharply near him at the supply depot, 3 adults appeared within 30 seconds. Not because they were required to, because they wanted to be. My entire framework for relationships was built on function, on bloodline proximity and mutual benefit and rank obligation. What I was observing had no transactional structure I could identify. One evening, Darian found me standing outside the common hall, watching through the window as a family ate dinner together. A child fell off a chair and was caught, and the whole table erupted into laughter, and I was watching it with the intensity of someone trying to translate a language they have never heard. "You're studying them," he said. "Yes," I said. He stood beside me. "What do you see?" "Something I don't have a word for," I said. "Among my people, family bonds are categorized by genetic proximity and social function. I cannot identify the function of what they are doing in there." He was quiet for a moment. "It has one," he said. "It just operates on a longer timeline than you might be measuring for." I looked at him. His face was steady and quiet, and there was something in it I filed away without knowing what shelf to put it on. 3 weeks into Calum, Darian called me in for a brief administrative meeting. He had received my full diplomatic file, as hosting officials do. He opened it to a specific page and looked at me, and I saw the confusion before he spoke. "There is a section in here about your medical history," he said. "Why was that included?" I went still. The particular stillness that means something requires careful management. "It was considered relevant," I said. "Relevant to what?" "To the arrangement. My people determined that I am unable to produce an heir. It was included as pertinent information." He looked at the file, then at me, and without performance, without calculated kindness, he said, "Why would I need to know that?" I had no answer. I had carried that fact for years. It was the sentence underneath my name, the reason for everything, the disposal, the 48 words, the throne room silence, all of it. It was the defining central fact of my adult life, and he looked at it and found the question itself strange. I sat in my quarters that night and felt something shift beneath the foundation of everything I had been taught to believe about myself. I did not know yet what it was moving toward. I would find out. The ground gave way without warning, and that is exactly where the real story begins. 6 weeks into Calum, Darian led a small geological survey team into the Eastern Ridge, a section of plateau the colony was considering for expansion. The team was 4: Darian, an engineer named Felix, a geological technician named Ren, and me. I had asked to come. I was not entirely certain why. Something about the restlessness of too many days spent only observing when my mind is designed for use. 3 hours into the survey, while Felix and Ren were recording measurements 30 meters along the ridge face, I felt something change. Not dramatically. Vethkai geology is dramatic. This was subtle. A very low vibration in the rock under my feet. A particular shift in the dust pattern along the ridge's eastern face. A sound too low and too brief for human ears. Felix and Ren had not registered it yet. I moved to Darian's side and said, quietly, but without hesitation, "We need to move 12 meters north. Now, all 4 of us." He looked at me. "There is a second fracture line running parallel to the visible one, deeper and under significantly more load pressure. It will give way in approximately 40 seconds. He did not ask how I knew. He turned to Felix and Ren and used the flat, unhurried tone of someone who does not repeat instructions. "North, 12 meters, move now." We moved. 37 seconds later, the surface behind us dropped 4 meters, clean and total, taking the entire section of ridge on which we had been standing. Felix watched it fall. He did not speak for a long time. Ren sat down on the rock and said nothing. Darian turned to me. There was a pause. Then he said, "How did you see that?" "Vethkai spatial processing," I said. "We calculate 3-dimensional load distribution faster than human cognition by a significant margin." I had been monitoring the fracture pattern since we arrived. He nodded slowly. Then he said simply, "Thank you." 2 words. No ceremony, no rank attached. Just real. I said, "You're welcome." And I meant it. The fact that I meant it surprised me a little. Something changed after the survey mission. Not suddenly, not with a decision or a speech. It shifted the way the quality of light shifts at dawn. So gradually, you cannot identify the exact moment, and then all at once, everything is different. I stopped waiting to leave. I had been treating my time at Calum as an endurance exercise. Moving through it with my attention fixed on some future exit point, cataloging observations but not permitting myself to invest in them. The survey changed that. I cannot fully explain why, except that acting on instinct to protect people and being thanked simply for having done it dismantled something in my defensive thinking that I had not noticed was there. I began working. Not the mechanical output of a woman trying to prove her usefulness through results, but genuinely working, bringing my full capability to problems because the problems were interesting and because the results mattered to people I was beginning to care about, however carefully I avoided examining that. I spent one afternoon with the colony's water reclamation schematics. The redesign I produced improved filtration efficiency by 22% and required fewer replacement components. I submitted it to the engineering team and said nothing further. Delia, the chief engineer, a sharp, efficient woman who had been professionally wary of me since my arrival, came to find me within the hour. She stood with the schematics in her hand, looked at me, and said, "You did this in one afternoon?" "One afternoon," I said. She looked at the design for another moment. Then, "Can you look at the atmospheric processor?" That was how I became, without any formal arrangement, a working member of Calum Station's technical team. Owen included me in the grid meetings. Delia stopped choosing her words carefully. Felix, who had said almost nothing to me since the day I arrived, began leaving coffee on my workstation in the mornings without comment, which I understood by then as a significant expression of goodwill. I also attempted to cook one human dish. Badly. Sevi found the recipe in the colony's shared files, and we spent one evening producing something that technically qualified as food, and that Darian ate with a completely straight face and described as an interesting interpretation. I argued the recipe had been ambiguous. He said the recipe was very clearly written. We argued about it for 20 minutes. It was the most entertainment I had experienced in years. I did not say that out loud. What I noticed, in the weeks that followed, was that the colony had stopped watching me. This sounds like a small thing. It was not. In the first month at Calum, I was aware at every moment of being observed, by people who were curious, by people who were cautious, by people making continuous quiet assessments of whether I was a danger or a disruption or simply something they had never encountered before and did not yet know how to categorize. I understood it. I would have done the same. The watching stopped around the time I began genuinely working. I cannot locate the exact day. One morning I was crossing the yard, and nobody looked up from what they were doing, and I realized it had been that way for a while. Owen included me in the shift briefing without introduction. Delia flagged me when a problem appeared in the composite ceiling on the eastern dome and asked what I thought before she called anyone else. Even Vera had developed the habit of calling out to me from her window when I passed, 3 or 4 questions already prepared, as though my stopping by was simply part of the rhythm of her afternoon. I had not been accepted through any formal decision. I had become part of the moving pattern of the place, the way people become part of somewhere when they have been present long enough and the presence has stopped being remarkable. Among the Vethkai, belonging was always granted from above, by bloodline, by rank, by the explicit recognition of authority. What was happening here had no top-down structure to it. I had simply done things, and the doing had connected me. I did not have a Vethkai category for this. I was still working out what to call it. Darian suggested, quietly and without pressure, that I speak with the colony's physician about a general health assessment, standard for all colony residents, he said. I agreed, mostly to confirm what I already knew. There was nothing to find. 3 Vethkai medical tribunals had established that definitively. Dr. Nora Webb was small, precise, and direct in the way of people who spend their lives dealing with things that matter. She had reading glasses she pushed up with one finger when she was working through something complex. She conducted the initial assessment in one session and then told me she needed additional time. For what? I asked. Cross-referencing, she said. Your biology against Vethkai xenobiological literature. A few weeks. Is that all right? I said it was fine. It took 17 days. Darian came to find me and Sevi in the common hall and said Dr. Webb had asked to see us both. The 3 of us walked to the medical facility together, and I was not afraid, because there was nothing to fear. Whatever she had found would confirm the existing findings. Dr. Webb had 2 datasets displayed side by side. She indicated the first. This is the Vethkai reproductive biology documentation in your xenobiological literature. Specifically, the diagnostic markers your people use to assess fertility. She indicated the second. This is yours. She looked at me over her reading glasses. By every measure I can test, she said, your reproductive biology is completely functional. The room was very quiet. That is not possible, I said. I ran it 3 times, she said. Then I went back to the original Vethkai diagnostic literature more carefully. She paused. The diagnostic framework your people use is calibrated specifically for internal Vethkai reproductive compatibility. It tests for hormonal alignment with Vethkai male biology. That is the only variable it was designed to measure. She let that settle. What your tribunals found, she continued, is that you are not reproductively compatible with Vethkai males. That finding is accurate, but they translated it into a conclusion that your reproductive system is non-functional. Those are not the same conclusion. The second does not follow from the first. I looked at the data. My training was sufficient to read it without assistance. She was right. I could see it. My biology was complete. Normal by any external standard. The tribunals had used a diagnostic tool built for one narrow purpose and applied it to answer a broader question, and no one had noticed the gap because no one had ever imagined the question needed to be asked differently. They never tested external compatibility, I said. The diagnostic framework does not include that question, she said. I do not believe it was ever considered necessary. Darian was standing beside me, and I was aware of him holding his expression neutral, not from coldness, but from precision, from understanding that this was my information to receive in my own way, without anyone showing me how to feel about it. I appreciated that more than I can properly explain. Sevi was not neutral. She pressed her hand over her mouth, and her shoulders shook, and I knew she was crying without looking at her. I said to Dr. Webb, "Thank you. I need time to review this." She gave me the full data file. I walked out. I spent 6 days in my quarters. Not in collapse. I want to be completely clear about that. I was not broken. I was doing what I do with large structural information, examining every face of it slowly, with precision, refusing to draw a conclusion until I had looked at it from every possible angle. What the Vethkai medical system had done was not complex, once seen clearly. They had built a diagnostic tool for one specific purpose. The tool worked for that purpose. But they had applied it to answer a question it was never designed to address, and then built an entire political and social response on the answer. And because the answer was convenient, because it provided a clean, medically sanctioned reason to dispose of a politically inconvenient daughter, no one had examined the methodology. A human doctor in a frontier colony, with 17 days and basic access to xenobiological archives, had asked a slightly different question. That was the entire difference. One different question. I sat with that for a very long time. On the 6th day, I asked Sevi to come in. She sat across the small table from me, and I looked at her and said, "They were wrong." She nodded. She had known since the day she read the report. "All of it," I said. "The tribunals, the disposal, the throne room, the 48 words. All of it was built on a test that was never measuring the right thing." "Yes," she said. I looked at my hands. Vethkai hands, with the faint iridescent quality of our skin, with the particular movement patterns that were not quite human. "How many others?" I said. It was not a question I expected Sevi to answer. It was a question I was starting to ask myself, already too large to keep inside. Sevi reached across the table and put her hand over mine. She said nothing. She did not need to. On the 7th day, I told Darian. We were sitting in the small room off the administrative block that had become, without any arrangement, the space where we had conversations that required honesty. He listened without interrupting, which was something I had already come to rely on without examining why. When I finished, he said, "What do you want to do?" "I don't know yet," I said. "That's fine," he said. "You don't have to know yet." I looked at him. "You're not going to tell me how I should feel." "Why would I do that?" he said, genuinely asking. I had grown up in a world where every significant event had a prescribed emotional response, an official reaction, appropriate to rank and circumstance. He was offering me nothing of the sort, just space, just time, just the question of what I wanted, as though that were the only question worth asking. Among all the things I had encountered at Kalem Station, this was among the most disorienting. "I'm not leaving," I said. "Not yet." He nodded. "All right. No negotiation, no conditions, no transaction." He just let me stay. The filtration tank alarm sounded at 7:15 in the morning, and I was already running before I understood why. I had been crossing the outer yard when I heard a sound that bypassed my reasoning and went straight to my feet, a single sharp shout from the direction of the water systems, the particular pitch that means someone has seen something go wrong and is past the point of managing their reaction to it. Felix was at the tank edge when I arrived, lying flat, his arm extended as far as it would go. A boy had slipped on the access walkway and gone into the filtration current. The tank was not deep, but the current was strong, and it was moving him away from the edge faster than Felix could reach. I went in. 4 strokes to reach him, 8 seconds to have him at the edge. Felix hauled him up while I pulled myself out, and the boy, Cole, I would learn his name properly later, sat on the rim, small and frightened, coughing the clean water from his lungs, staring at me with very wide eyes. His mother arrived 90 seconds later. She did not look at me. She looked at her son. She pulled him against her with the particular fierceness of someone who has only just understood what almost happened, and she did not let go for a long time. Felix sat beside me on the wet ground and said, after a moment, "That was fast." "Vethkai have a stronger swim reflex than humans," I said. He looked at me sideways. "You know what I think? I think you just didn't want him to get hurt." I opened my mouth. And then I closed it again. He was right. I had not calculated anything in the seconds between hearing the shout and going into the water. I had just acted. Because the idea of Cole being hurt was something my body refused to permit before my mind had a chance to deliberate. I had been watching humans protect people who served no transactional function. I had been cataloging it as a pattern I observed in others. Felix had just pointed out, without ceremony, that I was no longer only watching. I did not say anything else about it, but I thought about it for the rest of the day. In the months that followed, my integration into Calum stopped being something I chose each morning and became simply what I did. The way gravity is a fact, you do not decide to honor it, you just move within it. I had a routine now: technical work with Delia in the mornings, survey data review in the early afternoons, a standing informal meeting with Owen about grid improvements, evenings that varied, sometimes working in the common hall, sometimes sitting with Vera and listening to her talk about the colony's first years, sometimes in the room off the administrative block with Darian. The arguments with Darian had become a specific and somewhat strange fixture of my time at Calum. They ranged across military history, xenobiological theory, agricultural engineering, and occasionally the proper method of preparing the one human dish I had continued to cook badly on principle. They sometimes grew intense enough that he would throw a printed document onto the table in frustration, not at me, at the stubbornness of whatever historical decision we were examining. And once, when he did this, I laughed. A real laugh. Not the controlled expression of amusement that Vethkai aristocracy permits in formal settings, but an actual, unguarded laugh at the expression on his face when he realized what he had done. He stared at me, and then he laughed too. Afterward, I felt the laugh, and then felt ashamed of it, and then felt sharp anger at the shame, all three in the space of 3 seconds. I had been conditioned so completely to contain those responses that their presence felt like something malfunctioning. Later, sitting alone, I examined the anger at the shame. Where did the shame come from? From 30 years of training, from a court that equated emotional display with weakness, from the belief, absorbed so early it felt like biology, that I had to be precise and controlled at all times to have any worth at all. But I was not at the court. I was at Calum Station. And the people here laughed every day, freely and without apology, and it did not make them smaller. If anything, it made them more. I began to notice what I was choosing, not in the analytical way. I had been cataloging choices since I arrived, in a different way, softer, what I moved toward, what I was willing to let matter. Vera, the elderly historian, had taken to asking me questions about Vethkai culture on the afternoons when I sat with her. She was sharp and curious, and entirely unintimidated by my answers, which she treated as primary source material for what she described as her personal scholarly interest. She had 400 years of Vethkai diplomatic history she wanted to discuss, and I had the background to actually discuss it, and we talked for hours in a way that was entirely new to me. Conversation without hierarchy, without rank calculation, without anyone tracking what the exchange was worth. I mentioned this to Darian once. He said Vera had been collecting people's knowledge for 62 years, and that she had told him I was the most interesting primary source she had ever found. I found that I was pleased. I did not examine the fact that I was pleased. I was trying to be less aggressive about examining things. I was also, quietly, conducting a different kind of research. I had access to the Colonial Authority's xenobiological database through the station's network. More importantly, I had access to the Vethkai historical academic archives, not the official curated history, but the full scholarly record, including medical documentation and social history going back centuries. I started with my own case. I found the tribunal records, cross-referenced them against the diagnostic framework, and annotated every point where the methodology departed from what it claimed to be measuring. The departures were consistent and repeated and had apparently never been noted or challenged by anyone with access to both documents simultaneously. Then I went further back. I was careful. I moved through decades of records with the same precision I brought to technical redesigns. What I was looking for was a pattern, and I found it, and it was exactly as systematic as I had feared. Over 200 years, I identified 93 cases of Vethkai daughters formally declared reproductively non-viable by the same diagnostic framework. 93. Some had been reassigned to lesser roles in distant territories of the Dominion. Some had been placed in diplomatic arrangements, given to allied powers as political instruments, exactly as I had been. Some ceased to appear in any record after a certain date, which was its own kind of documentation. None of them had ever been retested using external compatibility parameters, because the question had never been asked. I want to explain what it feels like to find that particular fact in a historical record. It is not like finding evidence of malice. Malice would have been, in a strange way, easier to process. What I was reading was evidence of a system that had made its assumptions invisible to itself, that had encoded a limitation so deeply into its own operating logic that the limitation stopped being visible as a limitation and became simply the way things were. The people who ran those tribunals had not been lying. They had been using the tools they had, answering the question the tools were designed to answer, and they had never noticed the question was too small. Over 200 years. 93 daughters. And in every case, the political structure had benefited from the answer. In every case, the answer had allowed the court to resolve an inconvenient situation cleanly. The diagnostic result was not the cause of the disposal. The diagnostic result was the cover for a decision that had already been made by other factors, by the politics of succession, by the cost of an unmarriageable daughter in a system that valued daughters primarily for what they could produce. I am a precise person. I have been trained to be precise. I sat with this information, and I examined it from every angle, and what I kept finding, at every angle, was the same structure. A system built to answer one question, applied to serve a different agenda, maintained across 2 centuries because the answer it produced was always useful to the people with the power to question it. I sat with those 93 records over 3 evenings and felt something in me go cold, and then hard, and then purposeful. Not the kind of purposeful that precedes a rash decision, the kind that follows from understanding the full shape of something and beginning to calculate what to do with the knowledge. The system had not failed by accident. It had been constructed in a way that made certain conclusions easy to reach and certain questions permanently invisible. The conclusions it made easy were always the ones that served the court. And the court had known, not every member perhaps, but the institution knew, the way large institutions know things without anyone having to explicitly agree, that this test was imprecise, that its application was broader than its design, and that challenging it would cost more politically than allowing it to continue. I had not been an accident. I had been a feature of the system. Sevi found me after the 3rd evening, sitting in front of the records with the particular stillness I have when processing something very large. She sat beside me and looked at the display and said, after a long silence, "How many?" 93 documented, I said. "The true number is almost certainly higher." She was quiet. "I'm keeping every record," I said. "Good," she said. She did not ask what I planned to do with them. She trusted me to know when I understood the full picture. That is one of the things about Sevi. She has never required a plan from me before I am ready to have one. The relationship between Darian and me was changing in ways I was aware of and was choosing, somewhat deliberately, not to examine too directly. I recognized the avoidance. I was not ready to stop using it yet. But I noticed things. I noticed that I knew his coffee preference without having to think about it. I noticed that I monitored his schedule in a way that had no strategic justification. Not to plan around him, but because knowing where he was had become a background condition of my day. I noticed that when he was in a difficult meeting with supply officials, I found reasons to be nearby, not intervening, just present. He noticed things too. He noticed when I had not slept, which showed in a very specific way in Vethkai eyes, and he would leave coffee on my workstation without comment. He noticed when I was working through something difficult, because my language became more precise under stress, and he matched my precision without making it a point of attention. Once, I was explaining a redesign of the colony's communication relay to Delia and Owen, and I lost a technical term in translation, a Vethkai word with no clean English equivalent, describing a particular load distribution pattern. I stopped mid-sentence, searching for it. From the back of the room, Darian said, quietly, "Parallel frequency interference?" I looked at him. Yes, exactly. Delia and Owen continued without comment. I thought about it for a week. The thing I kept returning to was not that he had found the right phrase. Any technically literate person with access to the right reference material could have done that. What I kept returning to was the fact that he had been listening closely enough to make the attempt, that he had been tracking the architecture of what I was saying with sufficient attention to bridge the gap when I could not. That requires a quality of attention that most people do not give to most things. The Vethkai court gave it to matters of politics and succession. Darian gave it to whatever happened to be in front of him, and he did this consistently, for everyone, and he did not appear to regard it as an effort. I had spent 30 years in a court where attention was a resource allocated strategically, where you paid attention to things in direct proportion to their political usefulness, where paying close attention to something was itself a signal, to others and to yourself, about what you valued. He paid close attention to everything, not because everything was politically useful, because he had simply decided that paying attention was the correct way to be in the world. I thought about that for considerably longer than a week. Dr. Webb had become someone I spoke with regularly, not in a clinical capacity, but in the way that people begin to talk when they discover they find each other's thinking genuinely interesting. One afternoon she asked me, carefully, whether I had ever spoken with anyone about what the infertility diagnosis had cost me as a person, beyond the political consequences. I said no. She did not push. She said that if I wanted to, she was available. I thought about it for 2 weeks. Then one evening, I went to the medical facility and sat across from her and talked. Not in any organized sequence, not with the formal structure of Vethkai emotional disclosure. I talked about the tribunal, about my father's expression in the throne room, about the 48 words, about the silence during the ceremony when I had stood in gold robes and said nothing, because I had believed, completely and without question, that they were right. Dr. Webb listened. She took no notes. She did not try to solve anything, or correct anything, or provide the next step. When I finished, she said, "They took something from you that was never theirs to take." I sat with that. "They used a medical report to do it," I said, "a report that was measuring the wrong thing." "Yes," she said, "but the report was the tool. What they were actually taking was your belief in your own worth. That is what they needed the report for." I thought about that for a long time after. It explained things I had been puzzling over. Why even here, even after years of evidence that I was capable and wanted in this community, I still caught myself keeping score. Still calculating whether I had contributed enough to justify being here. Still operating like someone who needed to prove something in order to be allowed to stay. No one at Calum had ever asked me to prove anything. They had simply made room. The message came on a Thursday. It arrived through the Colonial Authority's official diplomatic channel, forwarded from the Vethkai embassy on the nearest border station. Darian brought it to me personally and stood nearby while I read it. My father was ill, not dying, but diminished. His illness had destabilized the court's political structure. My younger sibling Raylan was being positioned for succession, but Raylan was young and inexperienced, and the council was fragmenting around the selection. The political weight of the Dominion was shifting, and no single figure was holding it steady. The council wanted me to return, not to rule, not to take back what they had stripped from me, to stabilize, to be useful, to serve the court that had disposed of me, now that they had something they needed from me again. I read it twice. Then I set it down. Darian was looking at me, not at the message. "They need me," I said. "Yes," he said. "They did not need me when they threw me away." "No," he said. I looked at the message again. At the formal language, the careful diplomatic phrasing, the signature of Counsel Senior Oreth, the man who had stood in the throne room 3 years ago and looked through me as completely as my father had. 37 days. I gave them nothing. No acknowledgement, no refusal, no indication of what I would decide. I let them wait and understand what waiting felt like when the answer belonged entirely to someone else. On the 37th day, I wrote 4 words and sent them. "I will come." Changed. I sat back and looked at the red dust plains through the window and thought about everything I was bringing back with me that I had not been carrying when I left. 4 words. 37 days of silence before them. I thought they would be sufficient. We launched before Calem's dawn, before the colony was awake enough to see us go, and I was glad of that. Not because I did not want to say goodbye, because I had lived among people who valued action over ceremony, and I had come to understand why. The work I had done there would continue without me. The records I had kept were already submitted to the colonial authorities' diplomatic archive. Owen had the grid improvements fully integrated. Delia had the atmospheric processor designs. Dr. Webb's report was published, peer-reviewed, and accepted by 3 independent xenobiological journals. Calem Station did not need my goodbye. It needed me to go and do what I had spent 3 years preparing to do. I was at my workstation before the ship had cleared orbit. Darian had set up the conference room as a working space without being asked. Long table, full display capacity, complete access to the colonial authorities' legal and diplomatic database. When I walked in on the first morning, he was already there with coffee, and a look that meant he had anticipated this. "You're building a case," he said. "I am building a case," I said. "What do you need from me?" I sat down. "The Colonial Authority legal review. I need it verified through official channels. If my succession standing holds the way we believe, I need that confirmation coming from an external source they cannot dismiss as our own reading." "Already requested," he said, 3 days ago. I looked at him. He met my look with the particular expression that meant he had been paying attention before I thought he had. "You anticipated this," I said. "I have met you," he said. The case I was building was political, legal, and documented to a degree the Vethkai Council would not be expecting. This was the core difference between how the Vethkai and humans argue, and I had spent 3 years not just observing that difference but studying it, applying it to my own thinking, understanding why evidence-first argumentation is structurally stronger than authority-first when you are challenging a hierarchy from the outside. The Vethkai argue by rank. The more senior your position in the bloodline and court structure, the more weight your words carry. It is a system that works efficiently within a closed hierarchy where the assumptions go unchallenged. It collapses when the person challenging the hierarchy enters with documented evidence rather than competing rank, because rank-based argumentation has no procedure for responding to verifiable facts. You can outrank a person. You cannot outrank a peer-reviewed xenobiological report already on the official record. I had Dr. Webb's 17 pages of cross-referenced analysis, published and accepted by 3 independent institutions. I had the Vethkai Diagnostic Framework documentation, annotated at every point of methodological failure. I had the 93 historical cases, organized and dated and cross-referenced with the official succession and social records of the Dominion. I had the colonial authorities' legal review confirming what I had suspected. The tribunal findings had never been formally entered as a legal disqualification in the succession record. They had been treated as politically self-evident, which meant my legal standing had never actually been removed. I had won before I walked through the doors. The work on this voyage was explaining it to them. Sevi organized everything with the focused energy of someone who has been waiting a very long time for exactly this task. She formatted the documentation into formal diplomatic packages, submitted through official colonial authority channels, logged to the Vethkai Legal Archive, and copied to 3 independent interstellar bodies that monitored diplomatic practices between species. Everything was on the official record 24 hours before we broke atmosphere over Vethkai Prime. I also spent part of the voyage preparing something that was not in any of the formal documentation. I prepared to speak the names. All 93 of them. I had the records. I knew the names. But reading them from a document in a council chamber would have made them evidence. Evidence can be disputed, reframed, buried in procedural objection. What cannot be buried as easily is a person standing in the center of a room and speaking 93 names from memory, one after another, without a document in hand. Memory is not a legal instrument, but it is something older than law. It says, I knew these people existed. I took the time to learn them. They were real enough to memorize. I spent 5 evenings in the conference room working through the names until they came in the correct order, without any pause. Darian sat with me for 2 of those evenings and said nothing. He simply sat, in the way he has of being present, without adding to the weight of something. When I finished the full list on the 4th evening, without a single error, he said only, "Good," and we went back to the legal documents. That was enough. On the 4th evening, I had been working for 8 hours straight when Darian came into the conference room, set coffee down in front of me, sat across the table, and said, "Can I ask you something?" "You always do, whether I agree or not," I said. He almost smiled. "The 93 women in the records. You are using them as evidence of a systemic failure, which they are. But they are also people. What do you want for them? Not as documentation, but as people." I set down what I was working on. It was a question I had been circling without landing on. I had been thinking about the 93 cases as proof that my situation was not individual but institutional, which was essential for the argument. He was asking me to think about them from the other direction. Those who are still living should be formally rehabilitated, I said slowly, their status restored in the official record, any succession claims they might have had, placed under independent review. "And if they do not want that," he said, "if they have built other lives and do not want to be pulled back into Vethkai politics." I thought about the women who had been exiled or placed in diplomatic arrangements, who had built lives elsewhere over years or decades, who might, like me, have found that the outside was more honest than what they had come from. Then they are told the truth about what was done to them, I said, and given the choice, not the court's choice, theirs, in their own time, with full information. He nodded, slowly. "That is the most important thing you are taking back with you." I looked at him. "More important than the legal argument?" "The legal argument gets you in the room," he said. "The other thing changes the room after you leave." I sat with that. 6 days before we reached Vethkai Prime, Darian and I had a conversation I had known was coming and had been managing by not looking at it directly. He did not begin it with weight or ceremony. He came in, set coffee down, sat, and said, "When we get there." "And after, what do you want?" "I want the diagnostic system suspended and independently reviewed," I said. "I want the cases reopened. I want the court to acknowledge what it did, even if only in the legal record. After that," he said. I set the cup down. "I have been thinking about it for 6 weeks. "I know," he said. "I have been watching you think about it." "I have been watching you watch me think about it," I said. He looked at me. "And?" I had learned things at Kalem Station that I did not have Vethkai vocabulary for. How to be somewhere by choice. How to build things that were not transactions. How to let people matter to you without first calculating what you would receive in return. I had learned these things the way you learn a language you were never taught as a child, with gaps, with wrong-footed moments, with occasional surprising fluency when you least expected it. "I do not know how to do this the way your people do it," I said. "What way is that?" "Without armor," I said. "The way where you simply say the true thing without engineering it first. I have watched people do it at Kalem, and I understand why it works, and my training still does not let me do it cleanly." He was quiet. "Then, you just told me exactly what you are struggling with, without engineering it." I stopped. He was right. I had said a true thing directly, without structure, without calculating the response first, and it had come out before I had a chance to prevent it. "That is what 3 years looks like," he said. "You have been learning. You keep calling it something else." I thought about the coffee temperature he always got right, the schedule adjustments I had stopped explaining as efficiency, the arguments I had pushed to continue because I did not want them to end, the 20 minutes arguing about the badly cooked grain dish that I had replayed in my memory more times than was strictly rational. "I called it observation," I said. "I know," he said. "I was watching you call it that." The silence that followed had weight in it, not empty, not uncomfortable, the kind of silence that happens when something is being allowed to exist without anyone rushing to categorize it. After a long moment I said, "I want to come back, to Calum." He looked at me. "I do not know in what capacity," I said. "I am not offering something fully formed. I am aware this is structurally incomplete." "It is complete enough," he said. "How?" "Because it is honest," he said. "That is always enough to start with." I picked up my coffee. He picked up his. We went back to work. 5 days later, Vethkai Prime appeared in the viewport. Blue gold, ancient, exactly as I remembered it, and somehow smaller. I stood at the glass, and looked at it, and understood something that had not been available to me 3 years ago. I had spent my entire life believing that world was everything. The ceiling, the floor, and the walls of all understanding. My father's court had confirmed this, that there was nothing of value outside it, that what the Dominion assessed was what was real. From out here, with Calum Station behind me, and the work of 3 years in my hands, and the knowledge of 93 names in my memory, I could see its actual size. It was a planet, significant, beautiful, ancient, but it was not the only thing that was real. I pressed my palm flat against the viewport glass and looked at the world I was about to re-enter, and I thought, I am not going back. I am going forward, into that place, as myself. Darian came to stand beside me. He did not speak. Neither did I. There was nothing that needed to be said. We were ready. The council chamber doors opened before the protocol official finished announcing my name, and that told me everything I needed to know about how afraid they were. Good. I walked in. No ceremonial gold. No royal regalia. The traditional garments had been delivered to the ship before departure, and I had folded them carefully, placed them in their case, and left them aboard. I wore colonial authority diplomatic gray. Clean, precise, nothing decorative about it. Sevi walked at my left. Darian walked at my right. The chamber was full. Every senior council member in their designated position, every court official with a claim to a seat, the formal semicircle of Vethkai imperial procedure, the banners overhead, the cold, precise lighting of a hall designed to remind whoever stood in the center of it exactly how large the institution was and how small the individual. I had stood in the center of halls like this my entire life. I knew exactly what they were designed to do. My father sat at the apex of the semicircle. When I saw him, I understood what 3 years and illness had done. He was smaller, not physically, but in the way authority diminishes when it has stopped being certain of itself. He looked at me with eyes I recognized and an expression I had never seen on him before. He was looking for the girl he had sent away. She was not here. I walked to the center of the chamber floor, and I did not bow. The court registered this. The particular quality of silence that follows an unperformed expected gesture swept through the room. Council Senior Oreth rose and began the formal welcome in the traditional mode. He was a skilled political speaker, practiced at saying significant things in language that committed to nothing. He spoke for 4 minutes about the current challenges of the Dominion, the needs of the succession, the wisdom of reaching across diplomatic lines in difficult moments. He did not mention why I had been sent away. When he finished, I said, "Before we address the succession, I am informing the court that documentation has been entered into the official Dominion legal record." Orith began to say the council was not formally in session for document submission procedures. The Colonial Authority Diplomatic Office submitted it through official channels 26 hours ago, I said. Under the interstellar diplomatic protocols of the Calum Accord, submissions from a recognized diplomatic partner take immediate legal effect and cannot be blocked by procedural objection from the receiving party. The documentation is already in your record. I am here to explain its contents. The chamber was completely still. The Vethkai argue by rank. I was arguing with records that were already filed, already on the official legal archive of the Dominion itself. They had no procedural mechanism for responding to that because the situation had never occurred before. No one had ever challenged the court from the outside, using the court's own legal framework as the instrument. I began with Dr. Webb's report. I did not read it aloud in full. I summarized it in the precise technical language of Vethkai medical terminology, using their vocabulary, their classification system, their standards of scientific rigor, so that no member of the court could claim the findings were foreign and therefore dismissible. My reproductive biology was fully functional. The diagnostic finding that had defined 3 years of my life and 30 years of my self-understanding was the product of a tool applied to the wrong question. The court physician, Aldath, rose and stated that the Vethkai diagnostic framework had been applied and validated across centuries of practice. Validated for one specific purpose, I said, internal compatibility assessment. The original design documentation specifies this clearly. The tribunal applied it to assess absolute reproductive function, a broader question the framework was never designed to address. The methodological gap is documented in the framework's own design specifications. The departure between what the test was designed to measure and what the tribunal concluded from it is visible in the first 6 paragraphs of the design document. Aldath sat down. Then I spoke the names, not as performance, not to create a dramatic moment. I had memorized all 93 of them on the voyage because they deserved to be spoken by someone who had taken the time to know them, and the chamber was going to hear them whether it was ready to or not. I read them from memory, name by name, the date of each tribunal finding, the documented outcome for each woman. I noted where outcomes were not documented, and I said clearly that the absence of a record was itself a form of record. By the time I finished, the chamber had the quality of silence I associate with very large things settling into place. Orith had recovered his composure. He was a trained political operator, and composure under pressure was his primary professional skill. He rose and acknowledged that the documentation would receive appropriate review, but that the matter before the court was the succession, and on the matter of succession, my legal standing would need to be formally established before any further discussion. My legal standing was never formally altered, I said. He stopped. The tribunal findings were entered into the medical record, I said. They were never entered into the succession record as a legal disqualification. I have the succession law documentation here. The Colonial Authority's legal review, conducted by 3 independent scholars under the authority of the Calum Accord, confirms this. My standing in the succession has been legally intact throughout. The court has been operating on an assumption that was never formalized into law. The silence this time had a different quality, the quality of a room discovering that the ground under a long-held position is not what they believed it to be. A council member named Verith, younger than Orith, visibly sharper, calculating ahead, rose and addressed the practical authority question. I had spent 3 years in a human colonial settlement under human governance, placed there as a diplomatic instrument. What standing, practically, did I enter on? It was the question Orith had arranged for him to ask. Darian stepped forward. I had not told him to. He had not asked. He had judged the moment and moved into it, which was exactly the decision I would have made. He did not raise his voice. He did not present himself as a challenge or a threat. He said that in 3 years he had observed Alindra Voshal save 4 lives, redesign the water and power infrastructure of a frontier colonial station with results that exceeded the original engineering specifications, and contribute more to the practical understanding between human and Vethkai biology and culture than 2 decades of official diplomatic exchange had managed to produce. He said that she had been declared without value based on a question that had never been asked. And he said that this pattern of overlooking something because examining it would be costly was one that humanity recognized because humans had spent centuries practicing it themselves. They had documented every instance in their history, every failure, every collapse, every moment when convenient blindness had compounded into catastrophe. They kept those records not as punishment but as instruction, because the only way to stop repeating a mistake is to be honest about having made it. He said, "Your civilization is 4,000 years old. Humanity is barely in its 3rd century of space travel. We have made every mistake that exists. What we have learned, the hard way, the only way we ever learn anything, is that overlooking something because it is convenient not to see it is not a stable strategy. It does not hold, it compounds. In this case, it compounded for 200 years and produced 93 documented instances of the same error. You have the records. You can count them yourselves." He said it without anger, without diplomatic armor, without any performance of authority. He said it the way you tell someone their structural calculations are wrong, not to condemn them, but because the building will fall if nobody says so, and a building falling is worse than an uncomfortable conversation. The council did not have a procedure for responding to sincerity used this way. Sincerity in Vethkai political culture is deployed as a strategic tool, carefully calibrated and clearly performative. What Darian had done was be genuinely, plainly honest. No calculation in it, no technique, just the truth, said directly. And the court had no countermove for that, because all their countermoves were designed to respond to strategy. I watched them look for the countermove and not find it. Varath, after a long pause, said the documentation would require thorough review. "Yes," I said, "and while the review proceeds, I will present the conditions under which I am prepared to assist with stabilizing the succession." The court had expected relief. They had expected a returning daughter, grateful to be recalled, willing to smooth things over and step back into whatever role was convenient and ask for nothing in return. I was not that. "First," I said, "the diagnostic framework currently used for reproductive assessment is suspended immediately, pending a complete independent review by an external xenobiological panel. At least 2 members of that panel must be from non-Vethkai institutions. The colonial authority has offered to assist in assembling it. All cases conducted under the current framework in the last 200 years are reopened." Oreth drew breath. I continued. "Second, every living woman in the documented historical cases will be formally notified of what is now established about the diagnostic framework's limitations. Each will receive formal rehabilitation of her official status in the Dominion record. Each will be offered the opportunity to have any succession claims reviewed by an independent legal body. No woman will be required to pursue any claim. The choice belongs to each of them individually, to be made in their own time with full information." The chamber was listening now, with the particular attention of people who understand that something is being established that will outlast this session. "Third, I will serve as regent, not empress, regent, for a period of 2 years, during which time the succession will be addressed in full accordance with the law as it is written. My sibling Raylan will be included in the administrative process from the beginning, with full access to all relevant documentation and a formal advisory role. I want no successor unprepared for what they are inheriting." Varath said, "And your own claim?" "I have a legal claim," I said. "What I do with it is a decision I will make during the regency, with full information, without pressure from this court or any other, in my own time." The chamber absorbed this. Then my father spoke, in the voice that had once filled rooms and felt enormous. in the voice that was now just the voice of a tired man who had made a particular kind of mistake for a long time and was beginning, perhaps, to understand the weight of it. He said, "You came back." "I said I would," I said. "I did not know if you would." I looked at him, fully, without looking away, without softening what I saw or what I showed. "I know," I said. "That was your assessment of me. You will find it needs updating." Something moved across his face that I had not anticipated. Not guilt exactly. The Vethkai court does not do guilt directly. It does not have the institutional architecture for it, but something adjacent to it, something old and accumulated and not examined in a long time. I did not forgive him in that room. Forgiveness was not what the moment was. What the moment was, I looked at a man who had been afraid and chosen badly and built a political structure around protecting that choice for decades, and I saw his actual dimensions, which were smaller than the throne had made him appear, and I decided that I could work with what he was without pretending he had been what he should have been. That is not forgiveness. It is harder than forgiveness in some ways and easier in others. I am still working out the precise definition. The council agreed to the conditions. They did not have another option, and by the end of the session they were aware of this. All 3 conditions were entered into the official record before I left the chamber. Oreth passed me near the door as people filed out. He looked at me with an expression that was almost respect, the kind that emerges when someone has outmaneuvered you with such precision that admiring the method is easier than being angry about the outcome. He said nothing. He nodded. He left. Within 2 hours, a message arrived from Raylan. Private channel. The tone was relief rather than resentment, which was a better outcome than I had planned for, and which told me something useful about my sibling's character that I filed away for later. In the 3 hours after the council session, several things happened with the efficiency of a court that has decided something and needs to manage it before the decision can be reconsidered. The legal documentation was formally entered and sealed. The diagnostic framework suspension was recorded in the official health authority register. 2 council members who had been present sent me brief, formal acknowledgments. Not apologies, not in the Vethkai political register, but acknowledgments in the particular diplomatic tone that says we are aware of how this appears and we are choosing to position ourselves as cooperative. Verath came to find me personally. I had not expected that. He was younger than most of the council and sharper than most of the council, and he looked at me with the expression of someone making a professional assessment rather than a personal one. He said, "The documentation was prepared over several years." 3, I said. He was quiet. Then, the human, Holt. He spoke without rank or diplomatic credential. That is not a standard approach. "No," I said. "It is not." It was effective. I looked at him. "It was honest," I said. In my experience, honesty deployed without calculation tends to be effective in rooms that are not expecting it, because all the countermoves in those rooms are designed to respond to something other than honesty. He considered this for a moment. Then he nodded, once, and left. I thought that was the beginning of a different kind of conversation. I filed it away. That night, I stood on the high balcony of the imperial residence. It was the same balcony I had stood on as a girl, before I understood what the court would take from me. The 2 moons of Vethkai Prime were high and clear, and the capital was spread below in its ancient, organized brilliance, towers of crystal composite and pressed metal, skyways lit with cool blue, the old palace gardens in their precise geometric patterns going back 1,000 years. Beautiful. It had always been beautiful. That had never been the issue. Sevi was inside, reorganizing the administrative records with the concentrated energy of someone who has been waiting 3 years to do exactly this. I could hear her through the open door, the sound of her working with joy. Darian came and stood beside me. The silence between us was comfortable. I had learned to recognize that kind of silence as its own language. Comfortable silence means nothing needs to be added to maintain the quality of the moment. It is one of the more efficient communication systems I have encountered. After a while he said, Does it feel like you expected it to? I considered the question seriously. I thought it would feel finished, I said, like something closing. I thought there would be a moment where it was done. And there wasn't? It feels like the first day of a survey mission, I said. Everything mapped, nothing yet walked. He was quiet. Then, is that good? I thought about the 93 women who would receive letters in the weeks ahead. I thought about the diagnostic framework being suspended. Every young woman in the Dominion who would be tested next year by a system that had been forced to ask better questions. I thought about Raylan, who would spend 2 years learning the actual work of governance rather than being pushed unprepared into the center of it. I thought about Calum Station's red dust plains, Owen and his laugh, Vera and her 400 years of curiosity, Felix and the filtration tank, Cole and his mother's arms, and the look on his face afterward, Dr. Webb and her reading glasses, and 17 pages of rigorous, patient honesty. Coffee left on a workstation before someone was awake enough to ask for it. Yes, I said, it is good. We stood together for a while longer, looking at the planet that had made me, and discarded me, and now, I suppose, needed me again, on terms I had written. I was not certain what I was here, not Empress, not yet, not without choosing it clearly and without pressure, not just a returned daughter, something in between, something that did not have a clean Vethkai title yet. Perhaps the Vethkai had simply never needed that title before. I had been given away because I was considered worth nothing. The court had offered me like currency that would not spend, something that had the shape of value but failed the test of it. They had sent me into the hands of a species they considered a minor civilization, barely worth the diplomatic paperwork. What they had not calculated, what none of them had thought to ask, was what I might become in the hands of people who did not check spending value first. I had become someone who spoke 93 names in a chamber that had never said them. Someone who went into a water tank without thinking because a boy was in danger and the idea of harm to him was something she could not permit before deliberation was possible. Someone who learned to cook one dish badly and was prepared to keep cooking it badly on principle. Someone who sat with a historian and talked for hours without calculating what the conversation was worth. Someone who chose, not what the court assigned, not what the tribunal decided, not what 48 words implied, what I chose. Darian looked at the moons. I looked at the moons. Sevi worked inside with the sound of someone who is exactly where they want to be. The night was long, and the city was lit below, and the planet was smaller than I remembered, and the future was larger than I had ever been permitted to plan for. I stood at that balcony and thought about the 93 letters I still needed to write. Not the official notifications. Those would go through the legal office, formatted properly, sealed and delivered through recognized channels. I meant the other ones. The ones I would write myself, one by one, to every woman in those records who was still alive and could be found. Not to demand anything from them, not even to suggest what they should feel, just to say, someone found the record, someone looked at what was done and understood what it cost. You did not imagine it, and you are not alone in having lived inside it. I did not know how many of them would respond. I did not know how many of them had built lives so far removed from the Dominion that the news would land as something ancient and irrelevant. I did not know how many of them would be angry, or relieved, or simply tired in the way of people who have been carrying something heavy for so long they can no longer quite imagine setting it down. What I knew was that the letters would be written. What they did with them was entirely their own. Darian was standing beside me, and I could feel him being careful not to speak into whatever I was thinking. He had always been good at that, understanding the difference between silence that needs company and silence that needs to remain uninterrupted. 3 years had taught me to trust that distinction. I said after a while, "There are letters I need to write." "I know," he said. "You should probably also sleep first." "Probably," I said. "For the record," he said, "I think you gave an excellent first speech as acting regent." I looked at him. I did not give a speech. I stated conditions. The distinction was noticeable, he said. I think that was the point. I thought about it. Yes, I said, that was the point. I took a breath of Vethkai air, thin and cold and ancient, carrying the smell of old stone and palace gardens and the particular, irreducible quality of the place that shaped you, and I thought, they gave me to a human because I was worth nothing to them. I came back knowing what I was worth. The difference is that this time I decided. No tribunal, no bloodline calculation, no emperor's assessment of what I cost and what I returned. Me, looking at what I had built and who I had become and what I was capable of, and deciding. That is the only measurement that was ever real. Now we begin.